Please, tell the court the truth. I saved your life. Tell them I did not steal your $1 million watch.
They stole her career. They stole her freedom. They even stole her child. But before this story ends, every single person who destroyed Chiamaka's life will fall to their knees, begging for forgiveness. If you have ever been betrayed by the people who should have protected you, this story is for you. Subscribe now and let's begin, because every betrayal leaves a scar, and every scar has a story. Thousands of elite high society figures stand completely frozen in a grand Seoul exhibition hall, while a blinding barrage of camera flashes turns the room into a sea of white light. Reporters stop taking notes, and multi-billion-dollar investors rise to their feet in absolute, stunned awe. A dark-skinned Nigerian woman walks alone down the most prestigious runway in South Korea. Her posture is majestic, and her steps are flawless, but her face holds no pride. It is completely empty. Beneath the expensive designer silk, she is remembering the harsh, metallic clink of handcuffs snapping tightly around her wrists, and the deafening boom of a heavy iron prison door locking her away from the world. At the edge of the stage, Kang Min-yi, the billionaire corporate CEO of Korea's fashion empire, watches her every step. His hands are clenched into tight fists, a profound, agonizing regret burning deep in his eyes. This woman once had everything before someone completely destroyed her life. Today, she has unexpectedly returned. Years earlier, the story lived in the bright, high-pressure world of a top university hospital in Seoul. Dr. Chiamaka, a brilliant young Nigerian medical graduate, had cleared the brutal Korean medical licensing exams against all odds and emerged first among the best. She spent her long days gently helping elderly Korean patients navigate the healthcare system, butchering the honorifics at first with a wide, self-deprecating smile that made the grannies pat her hands in reassurance. She pushed away bribes from corrupt pharmaceutical representatives, chose integrity over comfort, worked exhausting overtime without complaint, and spent her rare breaks encouraging sick children with handmade drawings. People in the ward trusted her entirely. She was a beacon of soft, genuine hope in a cold, sterile environment. Yet, behind the hospital's immaculate facade, an invisible hand was already moving. In high-level board meetings she was never permitted to see, a shadowy, unnamed executive voice on a speakerphone repeatedly ordered the hospital administration to audit foreign staff, quietly looking for a disposable scapegoat to cover up a multi-million-dollar medical supply deficit. Then came one rainy evening as torrential rain poured over Seoul, turning the neon lights into blurry, bleeding streaks of red and blue. Walking home down a dark, isolated alleyway near the Han River docks, Chiamaka's medical instincts suddenly flared. She discovered a dying Korean man bleeding out from a brutal gang ambush, his pulse thready and his skin ice-cold. Her instincts overrode all personal fear. Knowing an emergency ambulance might expose him to his attackers, she secretly hid him in her small, cramped studio apartment. She used her own hands to stitch his deep lacerations under a dim desk lamp, spending every last United States dollar and Korean won in her savings keeping him alive with black market antibiotics. She had unknowingly nursed Korea's most feared and powerful mafia boss, Kang Min-yi, back from the dead. For 3 days, she did not sleep. She watched his chest rise and fall, holding her breath until his fever finally broke. When his eyes opened, he looked at her with an intense, unreadable and deeply sharp gaze, not with gratitude, but with the cold, calculating assessment of a man who believed every human being had a price tag. Then,
Police!
An explosive bang shattered the quiet night. The front door was kicked entirely off its hinges. Armed tactical police stormed the room, pinning Chiamaka ruthlessly to the ground. She looked at the man she saved, her eyes begging for help, but Min-yi simply watched, his expression carved from stone, already calculating how this disaster could be leveraged. Soon after, the cold, terrifying courtroom of the Seoul Central District Court stood frozen. Chiamaka sat at the defense table in heavy handcuffs, her medical uniform still stained with dried blood. The trap had been meticulously set by a rival syndicate and quietly approved by a hidden benefactor on the hospital board to frame her. She stood accused of $1 million luxury watch theft, attempted murder, and armed robbery. The evidence was fabricated perfectly. As the prosecutor demanded maximum punishment for the foreign intruder, the heavy back doors swung open and Kang Min-yi entered the courtroom. Fully recovered and immaculate in a tailored three-piece suit, he took the witness stand. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Chiamaka, remembering every single second of her saving his life. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. He stared at her in absolute, icy silence and said absolutely nothing. Min-yi's entire psychology was driven by one central, poisonous flaw. He believed that total power solves everything, and that integrity is a luxury for the weak. To defend a foreign medical resident right then would expose his illegal shipping network to the state prosecutor, weakening his grip on his empire. He chose his throne over his savior, internalizing the choice as a necessary corporate sacrifice. His silence was her definitive sentence, 3 years in state prison. Her hard-earned medical license was instantly revoked, her dream destroyed entirely. Chiamaka didn't scream, nor did she look away. She simply stood in the courtroom, holding his gaze with a chilling, total silence that left him temporarily breathless. In that courtroom silence, she gave up her naivety forever. A brutal division of fates began.
Please, tell the court the truth. I saved your life. Tell them I did not steal your $1 million watch.
In the frozen courtyard of Cheongju Women's Prison, Chiamaka survived day by day. Her hands grew calloused, and her soft spirit hardened into steel. She lost her ability to trust humanity. A part of her warmth died in that cell forever, replaced by a sharp, guarded strategic mind. Meanwhile, Kang Min-yi built an untouchable corporate dynasty in Gangnam, securing multi-million-dollar deals and stepping over his enemies. But his choices left behind immediate, unannounced psychological scars. A stack of unopened prison report files sat on his desk, untouched during the day, though at night his hands trembled slightly over the paperwork. He refused to eat the luxury meals prepared for him, leaving plates completely untouched as he stared at a worn photograph of the small apartment room where his life was saved, trapped in a private, unacknowledged torment. He secretly routed anonymous, untraceable funds to her elderly patients back at the university clinic, a desperate, quiet attempt to balance a cosmic ledger he knew was permanently broken. 3 years passed. She survived prison, but her innocence was gone. Meanwhile, he built a massive empire. But his pride and his belief that power can track anyone down always failed him. Her trail went completely cold the day she stepped out of the prison gates because she purposefully avoided every public digital camera and transit system. On a freezing Seoul winter night, snow fell heavily over the dark asphalt. Chiamaka, dressed in thin, worn-out clothes, walked past a dim street corner with nowhere to go, her medical career completely dead. Suddenly, she noticed a heavily disheveled, seemingly drunk man stumbling blindly toward an open, dangerous maintenance gutter. Her medical instincts flared automatically, bypassing her cynical mind. She rushed forward, grabbing his coat tightly to pull him back from the edge to safety. The man stood completely straight and removed his hat, shaking off the snow. It was Kang Min-yi. His eyes were entirely sober, burning with an intense, toxic relief. The setup had been intentional. He used his immense resources to track her physical radius and staged the encounter because he knew her residual medical empathy would force her to act. He whispered that he had finally found her just as black luxury SUVs violently swerved around the corner, blocking the entire street. Elite bodyguards stepped out in unison, grabbing her before she could even scream, and took her away into the night. The interior of the breathtaking Billionaire penthouse overlooking the blinding Seoul skyline felt suffocating. Chiamaka stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her eyes burning with a quiet, unadulterated hatred that completely replaced her old warmth. Kang Min-yi stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, slowly swirling a glass of amber liquid. A massive corporate crisis had forced his hand. He was now publicly celebrated as Korea's billionaire fashion king, but his prestigious modeling company was actually the legal, spotless mask hiding every single underground shipping operation he ran. A rival syndicate, secretly backed by a hidden institutional investor whose name was scrubbed from the records, was executing a hostile corporate takeover, threatening to expose his shadows to international investors. If they backed out, his criminal empire would collapse entirely. He needed a shield, someone unforgettable, not merely beautiful, but someone investors would instinctively trust because she was completely untethered from the corrupt, old money system. He needed her. He turned from the window, his eyes burning with an intense, toxic possessiveness, and told her she must end her medical career permanently to run his modeling empire. His voice was a low, commanding rumble that expected immediate submission. Chiamaka let out a sharp, mocking laugh stripped of all her past empathy, throwing his betrayal back in his face, and stating she would rather starve on the streets. Minyi stepped closer, his massive shadow completely eclipsing her beneath the dim lights. His central flaw flared up. He truly believed his immense power could buy or force anything, even loyalty. He coldly informed her that it wasn't a negotiation, threatening to instantly enforce an outstanding $1 million criminal restitution judgment for the watch she was convicted of stealing. 5 seconds passed in freezing, agonizing silence. Chiamaka did not blink or yield. Minyi raised a single hand and snapped his fingers, and his flanking security men stepped forward instantly to bind her hands, forcefully pulling her into the back seat of a waiting black sedan that drove her into the heavily guarded gates of his private mansion in Seongbukdong. The massive estate felt like an incredibly polished prison with its gold leaf gates and endless manicured gardens, all surrounded by high-tech security cameras at every single angle. Chiamaka detested him with every fiber of her being. She spent her days pretending to comply, but her calculated mind secretly mapped the security paths to escape, though every attempt failed when the guards caught her before she could even reach the outer stone wall. However, a gradual, quiet shift in power began to destabilize the mansion's oxygen. Minyi's terminally ill niece, an orphan child requiring constant medical attention, lived in the isolated East Wing. The child was fatting, having not laughed or spoken a word to anyone in months. She represented the pure innocence that neither protagonist had left. Chiamaka broke past the internal guards one afternoon, drawn by the sharp sound of a medical monitor, and knelt by the little girl's bed. Her gentle medical touch and soft, soothing words worked a miracle. The child looked into her dark eyes and instantly bonded with her, letting out a bright, genuine laugh for the first time in months. The mansion slowly began to change, emotionally slipping out of Minyi's control without him realizing it. The house staff, witnessing Chiamaka's quiet dignity and her genuine devotion to the sick child, began to protect her without orders. When Chiamaka walked by, the terrified servants secretly smiled, deliberately misplacing security logs to give her moments of privacy. Minyi's cousin, the head of security, began respecting her deeply, refusing to treat her like a common captive. He watched her objectively, becoming the moral compass of the house and subtly challenging Minyi's cold orders, acting as the voice of his cousin's buried conscience. Minyi watched from the doorway, completely confused by his own emotions, his hardened emotional armor cracking every time he saw his niece smile at her, realizing his money couldn't buy the child's happiness, but Chiamaka's warmth could. When evening fell over the estate, Minyi walked into her quarters unannounced and threw an exquisite, highly expensive designer gown onto her bed, ordering her to get dressed for a mandatory investors' gala. Chiamaka did not touch the silk, glaring at him like ice and stating she was a surgeon, not his corporate puppet. Minyi's patience snapped. He grabbed her arm tightly, shoved her into the luxury bathroom, and locked the heavy door from the outside to force her compliance. Inside, Chiamaka's heart ran cold, but she did not cry. She got dressed, put on a complying, pleasant smile, and walked down to the kitchen, bypassing the distracted staff who purposely looked away. She picked up a canister of petrol and a lighter, stepped out into the private courtyard where Minyi's absolute favorite, custom-built luxury Lamborghini was neatly parked, and with absolute precision, poured the fuel over the hood and set it ablaze. The vehicle exploded into a massive, roaring wall of fire. The action created immediate, cascading consequences. The servants scattered in absolute terror. Rumors instantly leaked to the corporate board members via the security feed, prompting insurance investigators to launch an immediate, intrusive inquiry by morning. Minyi's authority appeared deeply weakened to his staff, and his underground enemies smelled a sudden vulnerability. Walking out of the mansion, Minyi looked at the ruined car and then at Chiamaka standing by the flames. The suspense was agonizing as everyone waited for his response. He clenched his fists in immense internal pain, his power useless against her defiance, realizing that while he controlled her body, she completely controlled his peace of mind. He simply turned to his cousin and quietly ordered him to bring another car. They refused to talk to each other for the entire ride into Gangnam. His cousin noticed the profound restraint, secretly admiring Chiamaka's unyielding spirit, knowing the boss had never let anyone live after destroying his property. The hatred and attraction between them coexisted in a dangerous, volatile silence. The grand, luxury ballroom in Gangnam was filled to the brim with old money investors, where the ultimate corporate trap was waiting for them. Minnie's powerful, traditional mother had arrived in town unexpectedly, enforcing the strict chaebol etiquette where family reputation dictates market value. She had secretly ordered his arranged, high-society Korean fiancé, Han Ki-won, to fly back to Seoul at all costs. Driven by a desperate fear of losing her status and becoming irrelevant, Ki-won arrived to find that Min-yi had forced Chiamaka to attend and pretend to be his fiancé, because Ki-won had arrogantly ignored his calls earlier. It became a complete, explosive mess. Ki-won stood in the center of the ballroom, her veins churning with pure, unfiltered jealousy as she watched Chiamaka locking arms with Min-yi. Nodding the dark skin and the absolute grace, she secretly signaled the MediaTek booth at the back of the hall. Suddenly, the upbeat music cut out completely, and the giant projector screens flashed with a blinding white light, blasting high-definition prison mugshots and criminal headlines of Chiamaka across the grand walls for everyone to see. The screens screamed the truth to the entire room, branding her a convicted criminal who had infiltrated high society. Millions of people watching the live stream online erupted into a frenzy of vicious comments. Min-yi's mother stepped forward, her face twisted in disgust, demanding that Chiamaka get down on her knees and apologize to save the company's crashing stock prices. The entire room stared, waiting for a breakdown, but Chiamaka silently lifted her chin high. She did not shed a single tear, controlling the room by sweeping her eyes across the hypocritical crowd, leaving the whispering investors completely speechless with her untouchable dignity. She walked away through the hall with absolute grace. The investors did not clap, but they remembered her fierce composure. Ki-won smiled in the shadows, believing she had won, but her malicious smirk stemmed from a desperate terror of her own family's impending bankruptcy. Her scheme was highly calculated, leveraging public media pressure to force Min-yi's mother to sever ties with Chiamaka, designing every subsequent move to utterly destroy the Nigerian woman to clear her own family's hidden financial atrocities. On a clear afternoon at a prestigious country club racing track, Chiamaka was permitted to leave the mansion briefly under the strict supervision of Min-yi's cousin. Pushed to her psychological limits, she excused herself to the restroom, but accidentally bumped into a handsome, elite horse rider near the stables. It was the same rival medical doctor who had unknowingly competed against her for the residency years ago. The moment she realized he was a practicing medical doctor, her walls dropped completely. They shared a small, peaceful conversation, an emotional breathing space where they simply existed, exchanging a few lighthearted jokes about the impossible complexity of Korean medical terminology. For the first time in 3 long years, someone treated her like a human being, and she accepted his invitation onto his horse, seeking a momentary escape from her gilded cage. Min-yi arrived at the country club at that exact moment, witnessing another man's arms tightly wrapped around her. His eyes turned pitch black with an explosive, possessive rage. His central flaw, the absolute belief that his power could dictate her life, flared to a dangerous peak. His cousin rushed over, begging him not to interfere, but the boss completely ignored him. He strode straight to the main announcer's booth, ripped the microphone away from the commentator, and ordered the event to stop right now. Approaching the horse with a clenched jaw, he commanded her to step down. When the rival doctor attempted to stand his ground, Min-yi threatened to buy his hospital by midnight and fire him before dawn. The doctor dismounted to confront him, but Min-yi instantly landed a devastating punch, knocking him into the dirt. He grabbed Chiamaka's wrist tightly and violently dragged her away toward the waiting SUVs, but as they reached the car, Chiamaka pulled back with such intellectual ferocity that Min-yi froze. She whispered that he hadn't won, but had instead shown every camera that a billionaire was threatened by a woman with nothing but a stethoscope, exposing his own weakness. For the first time, Minyi looked around and saw the reporters whispering, his public perception taking an immediate hit. Chiamaka climbed into the SUV voluntarily, leaving him standing in the cold realization of his own strategic error. That night, inside the dark mansion kitchen, Chiamaka was furiously chopping vegetables. The cousin entered the room quietly, his eyes revealing that he had secretly fallen deeply in love with her. He stepped closer to comfort her, but suddenly, the double doors slammed open and Minyi stormed in, his eyes burning with jealousy, ordering her to his room. The cousin stepped between them, blocking the boss's path and letting his loyalty to Chiamaka completely eclipse his fear of the family hierarchy. Minyi let out a cold, venomous joke about his cousin finding his missing rib and loving another man's property, then struck his own cousin across the face, sending him crashing into the kitchen counter. Chiamaka went completely wild with rage. She stepped forward, bypassed the guards, and slapped the mafia boss across the face so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. Silence dropped over the kitchen. Nobody breathed. The boss flared up in pure, homicidal fury, but instead of striking back, the raw, toxic anger between them snapped. The boundaries dissolved, and the tension of 3 years of betrayal and attraction exploded into a desperate, intensely passionate night of mutual obsession in her private quarters. They consumed each other like enemies who could not live without one another. The next morning, the heavy atmosphere lifted for a brief moment in the sunlit garden. Chiamaka sat on a bench with his sick niece, brushing the little girl's hair, a simple act of caring that slowly restored a forgotten, gentle part of her soul. Minyi watched from a distance, completely silent. Chiamaka turned and openly teased the mafia boss in broken, heavily accented Korean about how he acted tough in front of his men but was just a stubborn, frightened little boy. He hated the disrespect, but he shook his head and smiled a genuine smile. For once in his life, he had met someone real. But watching from the high balcony above, Kiwon's heart ran cold as she realized her position was slipping away, solidifying her hatred into a deadly plan. With exactly 3 days remaining before the world's biggest fashion presentation in Seoul, a chaotic, high-stress corporate fashion workshop became the new battleground. Failure meant total bankruptcy for the public company, and nobody had a single design idea. Kiwon had demanded that Chiamaka be demoted to a mere kitchen helper, but the dark-skinned woman stepped forward into the center of the frantic room. She unexpectedly possessed massive talent. Before medicine consumed her life, her analytical mind was deeply passionate about fashion design. She looked at the frustrated designers and explained that the human body is architecture, and that precision in a surgical incision is no different than precision in a tailored seam. The designers stood completely spellbound as her advanced diagnostic thinking transferred flawlessly into design planning, and the entire team chose to follow her lead completely. Chiamaka structured the design workflows like a high-precision surgical unit, beginning a relentless 72-hour battle against time with no sleep. On the final night, the studio fell quiet as the exhausted team left the finished pieces in the main vault, but an hour later, a shadowy figure sneaked into the facility, and a sharp, crackling fire accelerated through the space. Chiamaka walked into the studio the next morning only to find the entire main collection burned to ashes on the floor. Kiwon entered a second later, flanked by corporate security, loudly accusing Chiamaka of malicious corporate sabotage, while the design team stood in absolute panic. Minyi arrived at the scene with a mask of fury, but Chiamaka calmly stepped past the shouting fiancé and told the head designer to bring out the real collection. A hidden, heavily reinforced storage vault at the back of the studio clicked open, revealing the flawless main line of dresses hanging in pristine condition. Chiamaka had completely anticipated the desperate, fear-driven sabotage, having noticed a suspicious security bypass code registered to Kiwon's father's account days earlier, and had intentionally created a highly realistic decoy collection. The victory felt entirely earned because she actively outthought her antagonists, leaving the entire room completely stunned. The grand international runway opened to a packed crowd with a heavy, rhythmic bass pounding through the room. Kiwon, desperate to reclaim her narrative and hide her family's crushing financial debts, insisted on modeling the opening look. She stepped onto the catwalk with a smug grin, but as she reached the center of the runway, her nerves failed her. She lost her balance on her towering high heels and fell flat on her face in front of the global media in a complete, irreversible public humiliation. Then, the lights shifted to a dramatic, deep golden hue, and the music transitioned into a powerful African rhythm. The dark-skinned Nigerian woman stepped onto the runway, wearing the crowning piece of the collection. Complete, absolute silence fell over the grand hall. Her walk was majestic, causing the major investors to stand to their feet one by one, while the international media erupted into a total frenzy of flashes. On the live digital tracking screens, the company's stock prices skyrocketed past all historical records, crushing the hostile takeover in a single evening. Backstage, away from the roaring crowd, the humiliated Kiwon cornered Chiamaka, slamming a dark, binding contract onto the vanity table and demanding either her medical license or the creative credits. Kiwon explained that if Chiamaka signed over the intellectual credit and left South Korea immediately, her surgical credentials would be quietly and fully restored through a prestigious international medical partnership program in America that her family controlled. Facing a brutal internal conflict, Chiamaka stared at her calloused hands, torn between the flashing lights of the runway and the sacred vow she took to heal the sick. She chose her true purpose over empty fame, signing the document with a calm, steady hand. Her success cost her creative credit. Justice did not come cheaply. If your heart is still with Chiamaka, leave one word in the comments. Justice. She can't hear you, but millions of women like her can, because you are not prepared for what is coming now on the main stage. The final credit announcement was made to the investors, officially naming Kiwon as the sole creative genius. Minyi looked completely surprised, his jaw tightening as his deep-seated belief in his absolute control cracked. Chiamaka quietly slipped out the back door carrying nothing but a small suitcase and boarded a midnight flight to America. Her steps were independent, but a new scar remained. She hesitated to touch medical instruments, her hands trembling slightly as she re-entered the world that once threw her in a cell, the prison trauma permanently dictating her movements. In New York City, Chiamaka, dressed in pristine surgical scrubs, successfully performed an intricate, life-saving pediatric operation. She rebuilt her life under a completely low profile, earning the respect of the elite Manhattan medical community. But her freedom came with a heavy, hidden truth. Shortly after arriving in America, she discovered she was pregnant with the mafia boss's child. She felt shattered and deeply isolated, but she chose to keep the pregnancy not out of lingering attachment to Minyi, but out of a fierce, independent maternal instinct to protect the innocent life she created. Meanwhile, back in South Korea, Minyi searched the globe for her relentlessly. His silence during her trial had completely poisoned him psychologically, causing him to refuse to sit in his executive chair, choosing instead to spend his nights staring out at the harbor, surrounded by the designs she left behind. He realized too late that his immense power could buy an empire, but couldn't trace a single soul that chose to leave him. 3 years passed in a flash of calendar pages, and Chiamaka's reputation crossed oceans. Because of her rare expertise, she was headhunted for a massive international surgical partnership back in Seoul. She returned to South Korea not as a captive, but as a powerful, financially independent woman, having spent years preparing her clinical leverage to face the hospital board on her own terms. One morning, inside her new Seoul Medical Center, a critically poisoned young girl was rushed into the emergency ward. Chiamaka stepped up to lead the trauma team, ordering medications in rapid Korean. But as she looked up across the sterile metal operating table to consult the newly transferred chief surgeon, her heart stopped. It was Kiwon, who had used her family's remaining political ties to dominate the hospital board. The tension in the operating room became thick enough to choke on. Kiwon stared back across the bleeding patient, her eyes widening in absolute shock before hardening into cold, calculating malice. Neither woman spoke a word as their hands moved with practiced precision to save the child's life, but the silent war was instantly declared. The next morning, the heavy glass doors of the pediatric VIP wing swung open, and Minyi entered the hospital corridor, surrounded by his usual flank of men in dark suits, intending to check on the young patient. He stopped dead in his tracks, freezing completely. Standing by the nurse's station was Chiamaka, holding the hand of a beautiful 3-year-old Afro-Korean boy with eyes that looked identical to Minyi's own. Minyi's breath hitched, but his central psychological flaw flared to a toxic peak. He instantly misinterprets the scene, mistakenly assuming she built a completely new romantic life and had a child with another man during her 3 years in America. His long-buried love instantly curdled into a bitter, venomous jealousy. Storming into the administrative boardroom, he called an emergency meeting of the hospital executives. With a single stroke of his pen, he ordered the board to slash Chiamaka's experimental pediatric research funding from $500,000 down to a mere $50,000, coldly stating to his cousin that he wished she would fail, run out of options, and disappear from Korea forever. The terrifying truth behind the child lay in a past conspiracy. 3 years prior, Ki-won's father, driven by an intense, suffocating fear of their family's impending bankruptcy, had discovered that Ki-won had given birth to a child out of wedlock with the rival medical doctor on the exact same week Chiamaka was residing in the private New York delivery clinic. To permanently secure their family's access to Minyi's billions, the father had paid a massive fortune to a corrupt international courier doctor to execute a flawless baby swap at the New York facility, leaving Chiamaka to grieve a falsified stillborn infant while Ki-won brought the real, living Afro-Korean boy back to Seoul. Ki-won had merely complied out of fear, trapped in her father's criminal architecture. Back in the present-day Seoul Medical Center, the cosmic strings of fate began to pull. The little 3-year-old boy instinctively detested Ki-won. Whenever he managed to escape the care of his private nannies in the hospital play area, he did not cry for her. Instead, he ran straight down the long, white corridor to Chiamaka's private office, walked right inside, climbed into her lap without a hint of fear, and instantly called her mommy. Neither of them understood why their hearts beat in the exact same rhythm. Tiny, undeniable clues began to surface. Chiamaka, reviewing the boy's chart during a routine checkup, noticed severe medical anomalies and blood type markers that made it scientifically impossible for him to be Ki-won's biological offspring. Her mind raced, and her advanced diagnostic thinking and pattern recognition clicked into high gear. She began digging into the hospital's archived international digital registries, uncovering hidden cash tracking payments and encrypted offshore bank transfers, all signed by Ki-won's father's private shell companies. Knowing she needed absolute certainty, she enlisted the help of Minyi's cousin, whose loyalty to her had evolved into a powerful, quiet alliance. Together, they cornered the corrupt courier doctor in the staff lounge. While the cousin stood at the door, blocking any escape with his imposing frame, Chiamaka used her absolute psychological control, calmly laying out the financial fraud trail until the courier doctor completely broke down, confessing to the New York baby swap in real time. While the boy played with a toy on her office floor, Chiamaka gently took a discarded strand of his hair from his jacket and ran a secret, high-priority DNA analysis against her own deep tissue records stored in the New York Medical Bank. The digital screen in the dark lab flashed green, showing a matching percentage of 99.9%. Everything clicked into place. Chiamaka collapsed against the sterile lab counter, crying herself to sleep in raw, agonizing heartbreak and rising fury, realizing her biological son was right in front of her all along, being used as a corporate pawn. The narrative accelerated toward the wedding of the century at a historic, grand cathedral in the heart of Seoul. Ki-won prepared to walk down the aisle, fully expecting to access Minyi's multi-billion-dollar corporate accounts the exact second the marriage vows were legalized to clear her father's massive debts. The ceremony day arrived, and the cathedral was packed to capacity as the organ music swelled. Ki-won walked down the carpet, her white veil trailing behind her as she reached the altar where Minyi stood, his face unreadable and cold. The priest raised his hands to bless the union, asking if anyone objected to the marriage. Suddenly, a loud, ear-piercing screech of electronic static echoed through the sound system. The grand digital stained glass screens positioned behind the altar violently glitched out, changing to play a high-definition video loop of the financial fraud documents, and the filmed medical confession of the corrupt courier doctor admitting to the New York baby swap in real time. Evidence meticulously compiled and uploaded by Minyi's cousin from the tech booth. The high society audience gasped in absolute horror. The heavy, reinforced oak doors of the cathedral were violently kicked open from the outside as a full tactical police team stormed the venue, weapons drawn. Walking into the center aisle was the mafia boss himself, who had quietly stepped away from the altar during the digital confusion. He stood at the back of the church, holding his true son's hand, and walking gracefully by his side, dressed in an immaculate, commanding suit, was the dark-skinned Nigerian heroine. Kiwon's father was instantly surrounded by federal agents. Realizing she had lost her status, her wealth, and her future, Kiwon let out a blood-curdling scream, reached into the heavy silk folds of her designer wedding dress, pulled out a concealed, compact pistol, and pointed it directly at Chiamaka's chest. A loud, deafening gunshot echoed through the cathedral, throwing the room into total chaos amid screaming and shattering glass. The bullet, however, did not find its mark in Chiamaka's flesh. In the microscopic fraction of a second before the hammer fell, Minnie's cousin had already launched his body forward, intercepting Kiwon and slamming his forearm against her wrist. The weapon discharged into the high vaulted ceiling, shattering a priceless stained glass window, so that shards of colored glass rained down like sharp jewels onto the screaming elite crowd. Tactical police officers swarmed the altar like a wave of black ink. Pinning Kiwon into the expensive carpet, her white veil ripping away to expose her manic, tear-streaked face. Her father attempted to slip out through the eastern choir stalls, but federal agents cornered him, slapping heavy chrome handcuffs onto his wrists. The entire corporate dynasty built on fraud and stolen credits collapsed in a matter of minutes. Chiamaka stood frozen in the center aisle, her chest heaving, her eyes locked onto her son. The little boy was crying from the loud noise, his tiny hands covering his ears, until Minyi instantly scooped the child into his arms, shielding him from the sight of the arrest. He looked at Chiamaka over the child's shoulder, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming realization. The DNA records displayed on the giant screens behind him did not lie. This boy was his own blood, born from the only woman who ever saw his true self. The prison truth became entirely public, leaving a collective gasp among the high society figures as the full reality of her wrongful conviction settled over the room. News anchors across South Korea and global fashion networks scrambled to cover the story, broadcasting headlines that exposed the Han family's international fraud and vindicated Dr. Chiamaka. The public, who had once thrown digital stones at her during the Gala of Shame, now turned her into an untouchable icon of resilience. Women across Africa and Asia flooded social media with messages of solidarity, creating a massive movement under her name. Months passed in a blur of legal proceedings and corporate restructuring. Kiwon and her corrupt father were sentenced to maximum security terms, their names permanently erased from high society. But the fallout did not spare the mafia boss. Because his public modeling company was tightly intertwined with Kiwon's family credits, the exposure of the fraud triggered an intense, unyielding federal investigation into his underground shipping lines. His legal mask was completely shredded, and major international investors, realizing the dark history behind the corporate empire, began pulling their multi-million-dollar funds out of the business in droves. The feared, untouchable king of Gangnam was suddenly bleeding financially. His boards were empty, and his luxury offices were quiet as he stood in his high penthouse, watching his ships sit idle at the harbor below. The very system he sacrificed Chiamaka to protect was now turning its back on him. He realized with bitter clarity that the company did not survive 3 years ago because of his power or his money. Survived because of her genius. Without her presence, the empire was nothing but a hollow shell waiting to fall into the sea. In a quiet, sunlit room overlooking the Seoul harbor, the space was beautiful, filled with soft white linen and the calming scent of lavender. It was a private recovery clinic Chiamaka established with her restored medical credentials, funded entirely by her independent international surgery partnerships. She stood by the wide floor-to-ceiling window, dressed in simple, elegant medical scrubs, her long hair tied back and her face peaceful, stripped of the tension and hatred that had consumed her for years. Out on the green courtyard below, her 3-year-old son was laughing, chasing a ball under the watchful, respectful eye of Minyi's cousin, who now worked exclusively as Chiamaka's private head of security. The heavy mahogany door to the room clicked open, and the air shifted instantly, growing heavy with unexpressed history. Chiamaka did not turn around immediately, listening to the sound of steady, heavy footsteps crossing the hardwood floor, a rhythm she knew better than her own heartbeat. Kang Minyi stepped into the light. The billionaire fashion king, the feared mafia boss who once commanded the dark alleys of Seoul with an icy glare, looked completely different. His tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple dark coat, his shoulders slightly bent and his face worn down by months of corporate war and sleepless nights. He stopped exactly 3 paces behind her, refusing to cross the invisible boundary she had set between them, and took a deep, ragged breath. He told her he had tried to find her in New York, admitting that his pride had blinded him into thinking she had forgotten him or given her heart to another man. Chiamaka continued to look out at the water, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression remaining a calm, unreadable mask. She replied quietly, her voice smooth and steady like a scalpel, telling him that he hadn't looked for a savior but a proxy, someone he could control with $1 million judgment because his empire was slipping. She reminded him that he had locked her in a mansion, let his fiancé steal her credit, and slashed her hospital funding because his ego couldn't handle seeing her independent. Minyi stepped 1 inch closer, his hands trembling slightly in his pockets, admitting he did it to keep her close. He confessed that a man in his position didn't know how to ask for things, only how to take them, but that every time he looked at her, he realized he was the one who was truly a prisoner, dependent on her mercy from the very night she stitched his wounds. He let out a long, shuddering breath that hung in the quiet space between them, slowly moving his hands out of his coat pockets. The man who had never bowed his head to any corporate board or rival syndicate leader lowered his eyes toward the floorboards. He took one final step forward, and then, with absolute deliberation, the feared billionaire fashion king dropped completely to his knees, the heavy sound of his knees hitting the polished hardwood echoing through the silent room. Chiamaka did not flinch or gasp. She slowly turned around from the floor-to-ceiling glass window, her arms remaining folded tightly across her chest, standing above the man who had once used a court judgment to strip away her freedom and her identity. Minyi looked up at her, his face completely pale, his dark eyes shining with a raw, agonizing vulnerability that no one in South Korea had ever been permitted to see. He did not reach out to touch her medical scrubs, nor did he beg for her love or demand that she forgive the 3 years she spent surviving behind the gray walls of Cheongju Women's Prison. He knew that some debts could never be repaid with simple words or empty corporate checks, and he had already accepted the terrifying possibility that she might never let him back into her heart. This wasn't a negotiation to save his name. It was genuine, unconditional repentance. The lifelong worldview he built, the absolute illusion that power, leverage, and money could buy human souls, lies completely shattered on the floorboards beneath him. His redemption would require months of consistency, humility, and patience, and he knew he had not earned her trust today. He told her he was not there to ask her to clear his name, offering to let the fracturing empire and the closing prosecutors take everything. He confessed he had spent his life building a golden cage to protect himself, only to realize he had locked out the only human being who ever saved him without asking for a price. Shifting his gaze toward the window, he looked out at the sunny courtyard, where their 3-year-old son was running across the green grass, his bright laughter echoing faintly through the heavy glass pane. Minyi's jaw tightened with a deep, paternal ache as he whispered that he had missed the first 3 years of his son's life, because he was a coward, begging for a single chance to be the father the boy deserved, and to protect him from the shadows he created. Chiamaka stood perfectly still in the warm sunlight filtering through the glass, her face remaining an unreadable, powerful canvas. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, a heavy wave of history, trauma, passion, and justice balancing on the edge of a single word. She looked down at his bent shoulders, remembering the rainy night in the Itaewon alleyway, the cold silence of the Gangnam courtroom, the roaring fire of the burning Lamborghini, the blinding flashes of the Seoul runway, and the tiny Afro-Korean boy who climbed into her lap and called her mommy. She had won, and her vindication was complete. The man who once ruled her world was now waiting at her feet, his entire destiny resting in the palm of her hand. But what left him entirely suspended in the dark was the realization that she no longer needed him emotionally. Her survival, her healing, and her future were entirely independent of his power. She had evolved far beyond basic survival, standing before him as a wise, sovereign territory that could not be bought. She took a slow, deep breath, her eyes locking onto his with a freezing, majestic clarity, and tilting her head slightly, she quietly whispered,
I will decide when it feels right.
She turned her back to him without another word, stepping completely out of his shadow to look back out at the open water of the harbor. Minyi remained on his knees, staring at her silhouette against the bright sky, knowing he would wait in those shadows for as long as it took as the view slowly pulled back through the wide glass window, moving away from the clinic room, rising high above the green courtyard, where the little boy continued to play safely in the light, and panning out toward the endless, deep blue horizon of the Seoul Sea. The darkness of the unfolding reality remained heavy for a long moment, holding the collective breath of millions who watched her rise from a prison cell to the peak of international society. Across the city of Seoul, the news feeds continued to refresh, making the digital footprint of the Nigerian surgeon permanent. Her face was plastered on billboards, not as a model for a corrupt syndicate, but as the global face of independent medical excellence. The hostile takeover that Minyi spent his entire life trying to prevent had been rewritten. She didn't just save his company. She took the pieces and built an unassailable legacy of her own. Down in the harbor, the cargo ships sat still in the humid air, their massive iron hulls reflecting the setting Korean sun. Minyi remained in the room for a long time after the final words were spoken, not moving or looking away from her silhouette against the glass. He understood the cold truth of the medical world she inhabited. Some wounds take years of careful, sterile treatment to close, and forcing the needle too quickly only reopens the tear. He had chosen his vigil, and for a mafia boss who used to take what he wanted by force, this absolute submission was his ultimate transformation. Outside on the courtyard, the little boy kicked the ball one last time before running toward the glass doors, his small hands pressing against the pane as he looked up at his mother. Chiamaka smiled down at him, a genuine, unburdened smile that belonged completely to her. She had broken the cycle of betrayal, her future no longer an impossible deal dictated by a billionaire's whim, but a sovereign territory she governed with absolute authority from a position of complete emotional independence. If Chiamaka earned your respect today, stand with her. Like this story, subscribe for the next chapter, share it with someone who believes justice always finds its way, and leave one word in the comments. Queen! Let's see how many people stayed until the very end to honor a woman who refused to stay broken.